The North Sea remembers everything. It remembers the longships that crossed its gray waters 1,000 years ago. It remembers the men who sailed them, and it remembers the stories they told about death and honor and the thin line between the two. Among those stories, one stands apart, not because it is the most common, not because it appears in every saga or on every runestone, but because it asks a question that history cannot answer with certainty. The Blood Eagle. Even the name carries weight. It appears in medieval texts written centuries after the Viking Age ended. It describes something that may have happened, or may have been imagined, or may have existed somewhere between fact and metaphor, in that uncertain space where oral tradition becomes written record. This is not a story about violence for its own sake. It is a story about how we remember, how cultures preserve their past through poetry and saga, how words can shift meaning across generations, and how the absence of certainty can be more revealing than any definitive answer. The Vikings left behind ships and swords and settlements. They left behind laws and poems and intricate metalwork, but they left very little that explains their inner world with clarity. We have fragments, hints, stories written down long after the people who lived them were gone. The Blood Eagle exists in those fragments. It appears in two main sources. Both are Icelandic sagas. Both were written in the 13th century, describing events that allegedly occurred in the 9th. Both mention a ritual execution involving an enemy of high status. And both use language that scholars have debated for generations. Was it real? Was it metaphor? Was it propaganda written by Christian monks about pagan ancestors they wanted to portray as fierce and uncompromising? We do not know, and perhaps that uncertainty is the point. This is a long exploration. It moves slowly. It considers evidence carefully. It does not rush toward conclusions because the sources themselves do not permit rushing. If you are here for sleep, for calm focus, for the quiet pleasure of historical mystery, you are in the right place. We will walk through the Viking world as it actually was. We will read the sagas that mention the Blood Eagle and examine what they say and what they do not say. We will consider language and translation. We will look at archaeology and absence. We will think about who wrote these stories and why. And, at the end, we will sit with the question itself, because some questions in history are more valuable unanswered. If you find value in this kind of storytelling, slow, careful, built for long listening, consider subscribing to Archive of Rest. This is where dark history is told without haste, where the past is treated with respect, and where the goal is not shock, but understanding. Now, let us begin. The year is approximately 865 CE. The place is Northumbria, in what will one day be northern England. A king named Ella rules there. And across the sea, the sons of a legendary Viking named Ragnar Lothbrok are preparing for revenge. This is where the story starts, or where it is said to start. But to understand what may or may not have happened in Northumbria, we must first understand the world that produced the story. We must understand what the Vikings valued, how they thought about death, how they used violence, and why a ritual execution, if it occurred, would have carried meaning far beyond the act itself. That understanding begins not with blood, but with poetry. To understand a ritual that may never have happened, we must first understand the people who might have performed it. The Vikings were not a nation. They were not an empire. They were seafaring peoples from Scandinavia who, between roughly 790 and 1066 CE, changed the shape of Europe through trade, settlement, and violence. They came from Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. They spoke variations of Old Norse. They worshipped gods whose names we still recognize: Odin, Thor, Freya, though we understand those gods imperfectly through sources written after conversion to Christianity. But more than their gods or their geography, the Vikings were defined by a particular way of seeing the world. Honor was not abstract. It was survival. In a society without strong centralized authority, reputation determined whether you lived or died. A man known as trustworthy could form alliances, secure trade agreements, and marry well. A man known as weak or oath-breaking could be killed with minimal consequence. This was not cruelty, it was structure. The Sagas, those long prose narratives written in Iceland during the 13th and 14th centuries, return again and again to questions of honor. A slight must be answered. An insult must be repaid. Not because Vikings were inherently violent, but because silence in the face of dishonor was social death. And social death, in that world, often preceded physical death. Violence, then, was a language. It communicated status. It established boundaries. It resolved disputes that had no legal framework to contain them. But not all violence was equal. There was the violence of battle, chaotic, necessary, often unremarkable. There was the violence of feud, calculated, reciprocal, governed by unwritten rules about proportionality. And there was the violence of ritual, rare, symbolic, designed to send a message that transcended the immediate act. It is this third category that concerns us. The Vikings understood that how a person died mattered as much as the fact of their death. Execution methods were chosen deliberately. A slave might be killed without ceremony. A free man deserved a cleaner death. And an enemy of particular significance. A king, a betrayer, someone whose actions demanded exceptional response, might die in a way designed to be remembered. This is where poetry enters. The Vikings did not write histories in the way we understand them. They composed poems. Skaldic verse, in particular, served as both entertainment and historical record. A skald, a court poet, would craft intricate stanzas about battles, voyages, and notable deaths. These poems used complex metaphors called kennings, where direct statement was replaced by layered imagery. A ship might be called a wave horse. A sword might be called a wound fire. Blood might be called battle sweat. This was not decoration. It was the form itself. To speak plainly was to speak without art. And without art, events were not preserved. Here is what matters. In a culture where poetry was memory, the line between literal description and metaphorical flourish was not always clear. A phrase that sounded like a description of an act might have been a poetic way of saying something else entirely. We will return to this when we examine the specific language used in the sagas. For now, it is enough to know that Viking culture valued indirect speech, layered meaning, and the preservation of reputation through carefully chosen words. Death, in this context, was never just death. It was story. It was legacy. It was the thing people would say about you after you were gone. The Vikings believed in an afterlife, though its details varied by region and changed over time. Warriors who died in battle might go to Valhalla, Odin's hall, where they would feast and fight until Ragnarok, the end of the world. Others might go to Hell, a realm that was not punishment but simply the place where most dead resided. But more important than the destination was the journey. A good death, one faced with courage, without begging or cowardice. ensured that your name would be spoken with respect. A bad death, one marked by fear or dishonor, could stain your family for generations. This is the framework within which the blood eagle must be considered. If it happened, it was not random cruelty. It was not sadism for its own sake. It would have been a deliberate choice made by someone in a position of power, designed to communicate something specific about the victim and the executioner both. What that message was, we can only guess. But we can say this: the Vikings did not shy from violence, but they also did not glorify it indiscriminately. Their sagas are full of killing, yes, but also full of legal proceedings, arbitration, and compensation payments. They understood that unchecked violence destroyed communities. When violence occurred, it was meant to restore balance, to answer an offense, to demonstrate strength in a world where weakness invited exploitation. And when violence was ritualized, when it became something more than simple killing, it entered the realm of the sacred. The Norse had rituals for many things. Sacrifices to the gods, called blot, involved animals and possibly, in rare cases, humans. These were not acts of barbarism, but acts of reciprocity. The gods gave favor, humans gave offerings in return. We know this happened because multiple sources describe it, including hostile Christian writers who had every reason to exaggerate, but whose accounts align with archaeological findings of ritual deposits. The blood eagle, if it existed, would have occupied a different space. Not a sacrifice to the gods, but a statement to the living, a demonstration of power, a fulfillment of revenge so complete that it became legend. But here is the problem. We have no contemporary accounts. The events described in the sagas, the execution of King Ella, the death of Halfdan, allegedly occurred in the 9th century. The sagas that describe them were written in the 13th century. That is a gap of 300 years or more. 300 years of oral tradition. 300 years of stories told and retold, embellished and simplified, passed from skald to skald, from generation to generation, until finally someone in Christian Iceland decided to write them down. What survives that process? What changes? We know from comparative folklore studies that oral traditions are remarkably stable in some ways and remarkably fluid in others. Core narrative elements, who did what to whom, often persist, but details shift. Motivations are reinterpreted, events are combined or separated, and poetic language, especially, can drift in meaning. So, when we read in a 13th century saga that someone's back was cut open and their ribs spread like an eagle's wings, we must ask, is this a description of something that happened? Or is it a poetic way of saying they were killed in battle? Or is it a later addition, inserted by a writer who wanted to make the story more memorable? We do not know. And the Vikings themselves, if we could ask them, might not have cared about the distinction in the way we do. For them, the truth of a story was not always about factual accuracy. It was about whether the story captured something essential about the people involved. Did Ragnar's sons love their father enough to seek terrible revenge? Yes. That is the truth the saga wants to convey. Whether the specific method of execution happened exactly as described is, in some sense, beside the point. But we are modern readers. We want to know what actually occurred, and so we must look more closely at the sources themselves. The evidence is thin. In all of Old Norse literature, hundreds of sagas, poems, and historical texts, only 2 sources describe what might be the blood eagle. Both are Icelandic. Both were written centuries after the events they claim to describe, and both are maddeningly brief. The first is the Orkneyinga Saga, also called the History of the Earls of Orkney. It was composed in Iceland around 1230 CE, though it draws on earlier poems and oral traditions. The saga tells the story of the Norse earls who ruled the Orkney Islands north of Scotland from the 9th century onward. In one passage, the saga describes the death of Halfdan Halagur, called Halfdan Longleg, or Halfdan the Black. He was a Viking leader who, according to the saga, conquered the northern parts of Scotland and the Orkney Islands. But his rule was harsh. He oppressed the local population. He took what he wanted without regard for custom or law. Eventually, a man named Einar Rognvaldsson, Einar, son of Rognvald, decided to act. Einar was the rightful Earl of Orkney, driven out by Halfdan's aggression. He gathered forces, returned to the islands, and captured Halfdan. The saga says that Einar had an eagle cut on Halfdan's back. The Old Norse phrase is lit han orn resta abaki honum. Literally, he had an eagle cut on his back. That is all. No elaboration, no description of method, just that single sentence, followed by the statement that Halfdan died from the wound. The second source is more detailed, but also more problematic. The Tale of Ragnar's Sons. Ragnar Sona Thatar in Old Norse is a short saga that exists in several manuscript versions. It was likely composed in the 13th century, though some scholars place it slightly earlier. It tells the story of Ragnar Lothbrok, a legendary Viking, and his son's quest for revenge after his death. According to the tale, Ragnar was captured during a raid on Northumbria by King Ella. Ella had Ragnar thrown into a pit of snakes where he died. When Ragnar's sons, Ivar the Boneless, Björn Ironside, Hvitserk, and others, learned of their father's death, they assembled a great army and invaded England. They defeated Ella in battle and captured him alive. The saga describes what happened next in more detail than the Orkneyinga saga. It says that the brothers had an eagle cut on Ella's back. It says that all his ribs were separated from the spine, and it says that his lungs were pulled out. The Old Norse is more poetic than that translation suggests. The phrase blodorn appears, blood eagle, and the description uses language that could be literal or could be metaphorical, depending on how one reads the grammar and context. This is the entirety of the primary evidence. 2 sagas, 2 deaths, both involving enemies of significance, both described using similar language about an eagle and a back. Everything else, every modern discussion, every historical debate, every appearance in popular culture stems from these 2 brief passages. Now we must ask, what do these passages actually tell us? First, they tell us that by the 13th century, when these sagas were written, there was a tradition, oral or written, that certain Viking leaders had executed certain enemies in a distinctive way. Whether that tradition reflected historical events or literary invention is the question we are trying to answer. Second, they tell us that this method of execution, if it existed, was rare. It was not standard practice. It was not something done to common enemies or in the heat of battle. It was reserved for specific individuals under specific circumstances. Halfdan was a usurper and an oppressor. Ella was a king who had killed a legendary hero in a particularly humiliating way. Death by snakes, unable to defend himself, stripped of the warrior's death that Vikings valued. Both executions, as described, were acts of revenge. Both were public. Both were meant to send a message. Third, they tell us that the image of an eagle was significant. Eagles appear throughout Norse mythology and poetry. They are associated with Odin, the chief god, who often took the form of an eagle. They are symbols of power, vision, and death. To mark someone with an eagle, whether literally or metaphorically, was to invoke those associations. It was to claim divine sanction, perhaps, or to demonstrate that the victim's death was not ordinary but exceptional. But here is where the problems begin. The Orkneyinga saga was written roughly 350 years after Halfdan's death. The tale of Ragnar's sons was written even further removed from the events it describes. Ella died around 867 CE, making the gap nearly 400 years, 4 centuries, longer than the time between us and the English Civil War, longer than the time between us and the founding of Jamestown. What happens to a story over 4 centuries of oral transmission? We know from studies of oral tradition in other cultures that certain types of information are preserved with remarkable accuracy. Genealogies, for instance, the names of important leaders, the basic sequence of major events. But details change. Motivations are reinterpreted through the lens of later values. Events are dramatized to make them more memorable. And poetic language, especially, can shift in meaning as the cultural context changes. The sagas were not written as history in the modern sense. They were written as entertainment and moral instruction. They were meant to be read aloud, to hold an audience's attention, to convey lessons about honor and revenge and the consequences of one's actions. A saga writer in 13th century Iceland was not a historian. He was a storyteller. He drew on earlier sources, poems, oral traditions, perhaps written notes. But he also shaped the material to serve his narrative purposes. If a story had become more dramatic in the telling, he would record the dramatic version. If a poetic phrase had been misunderstood by earlier generations, he would record the misunderstanding. If a metaphor had been taken literally, he would record it as literal. This does not mean the sagas are worthless as historical sources. They preserve genuine information about the Viking Age that we could not access otherwise. But they must be read carefully, with awareness of their limitations. So, when we read that Einar had an eagle cut on Halfdan's back, we must ask, is this a description of a physical act? Or is it a poetic way of saying that Halfdan died in battle, his back exposed to the enemy, like an eagle with spread wings? When we read that Ragnar's sons pulled out Ella's lungs, are we reading an eyewitness account passed down through generations? Or are we reading a later elaboration, added by a saga writer who wanted to emphasize the completeness of their revenge? The sagas themselves do not answer these questions. They present the information without commentary, as if it were simply fact. But we know that saga writers sometimes invented details. We know they sometimes combined different stories or attributed actions to the wrong people. We know they were influenced by the literary conventions of their time, which valued dramatic confrontation and poetic justice. And we know that by the 13th century, Iceland was Christian. The people writing these sagas were Christian. They were looking back at their pagan ancestors with a mixture of pride and discomfort. They wanted to remember the Vikings as brave and formidable, but they also wanted to distance themselves from pagan practices that seemed barbaric by Christian standards. This tension shapes the sagas in subtle ways. Violence is described, but often with a certain detachment. Pagan rituals are mentioned, but rarely explained in detail. The past is preserved, but also sanitized. Could the blood eagle be part of that sanitization process in reverse? could it be a detail added by Christian writers to emphasize how different, how pagan, how fierce their ancestors were? Or could it be the opposite? Could it be a genuine memory, preserved despite the discomfort it caused, because the story was too well known to omit? We do not know. What we do know is that the sagas are our only textual evidence. There are no contemporary accounts, no Arab travelers who witnessed Viking executions and wrote them down, no English chronicles that describe Ella's death in detail, no runic inscriptions that mention the blood eagle. Just these two passages, written centuries later in a language that is difficult to interpret with certainty. And so we must turn to that language itself. We must look at the specific words used in the Old Norse texts. We must consider how those words might have been understood by their original audience. And we must grapple with the possibility that what seems clear to us may not have been clear at all. Old Norse is a dead language. It has no native speakers. No one grows up hearing it in their home. No one uses it to order coffee or argue about politics or whisper to a lover in the dark. What we have are texts, manuscripts copied and recopied by medieval scribes, runic inscriptions carved into stone. And from these fragments, scholars have reconstructed a language that was once spoken across Scandinavia and beyond. But reconstruction is not the same as understanding. Languages are not just collections of words with fixed meanings. They are living systems shaped by culture, context, and the unspoken assumptions of their speakers. When we translate Old Norse into English, we are not simply swapping one word for another. We are trying to bridge a gap of 1,000 years between people who saw the world differently than we do. This matters enormously when we examine the blood eagle. The key phrase appears in both sagas, though with slight variations. In the Orkneyinga saga, the text says, "Let han orn rista abaki honum." Word by word, let he eagle cut on back his. In more natural English, he had an eagle cut on his back. The verb rista means to cut, to carve, to inscribe. It is the same verb used for carving runes into stone or wood. It implies deliberate marking, not random violence. The noun orn means eagle. Straightforward enough. But here's the first problem. What does it mean to have an eagle cut on someone's back? Does it mean a literal image was carved into the skin? A drawing of an eagle etched with a knife, like a tattoo or a brand? Or does it mean something was done to the back that resembled an eagle in some way? That created an eagle-like shape or pattern? Or is eagle itself a metaphor? A kenning for something else entirely? In skaldic poetry, direct statement was often avoided in favor of elaborate metaphors. A warrior might be called a feeder of ravens because ravens ate the corpses left on battlefields. A sword might be called a fire of battle. Blood might be called wound dew. These were not decorative flourishes. They were the language itself. To speak in kennings was to speak like a poet, and poetry was how important events were remembered. Could cutting an eagle be a kenning for a particular type of killing? Could it mean exposing someone's back to weapons in battle? Could it refer to the way a body might look after certain wounds? Ribs visible, flesh torn, resembling the spread wings of a bird? Some scholars argue yes. They point out that the Orkneyinga saga gives no further detail. It simply says an eagle was cut on Halfdan's back, and he died. No mention of ribs, no mention of lungs. Just the image of an eagle and death. This could easily be poetic language for a fatal back wound. In battle, to be struck from behind was dishonorable. To die with your back exposed meant you had turned away, fled, or been overwhelmed. The eagle, then, might symbolize that exposure. The Aetur victim's back opened to the sky, to Odin's birds, to death itself. But the tale of Ragnar's sons complicates this interpretation. The description there is more elaborate. The text says that all of Ella's ribs were separated from the spine. It says his lungs were pulled out. It uses the compound word blowdorn, blood eagle, which appears nowhere else in Old Norse literature. This sounds less like metaphor and more like description. Or does it? The problem is that the grammar is ambiguous. Old Norse word order was flexible. Sentences could be structured in ways that seem strange to English speakers. And the manuscript tradition, the physical copies of the sagas that survive, sometimes contains errors, variations, or unclear passages. Different scholars, reading the same Old Norse text, have arrived at different translations. Some read the passage as a straightforward description of a ritual execution. The ribs were cut. The lungs were removed. The victim died in a specific, deliberate way. Others read it as poetic exaggeration. The victim was killed violently, and the saga writer used dramatic language to emphasize the brutality of the revenge. Still others argue that the passage is corrupt, that later copyists misunderstood an earlier text and corrected it in ways that changed the meaning. There is no consensus. One of the most influential voices in this debate is Roberta Frank, a scholar of Old Norse literature. In a 1984 article, she argued that the blood eagle was likely a misunderstanding of skaldic poetry. Frank pointed out that the earliest references to the blood eagle are not in the sagas themselves, but in poems that the sagas quote or reference. These poems use highly compressed metaphorical language. They were composed to be recited aloud, with the audience expected to understand the cultural context and poetic conventions. When later saga writers encountered these poems, Frank argues they may have taken metaphorical language literally. A poetic description of a warrior's death, his back exposed, his ribs visible through wounds like an eagle's wings, became, in the retelling, a description of a ritual. This is not implausible. We know that medieval writers sometimes misunderstood their sources. We know that poetic language can be opaque even to people within the same culture, let alone centuries later. But Frank's argument is not universally accepted. Other scholars point out that the sagas do describe other forms of ritual execution and sacrifice. They describe hangings dedicated to Odin. They describe human sacrifices at temples. They describe elaborate funeral rites. Why would the blood eagle be the only ritual that was purely invented? And if it was a misunderstanding, why does it appear in two separate sagas, describing two separate events, with similar language? The debate continues. Part of the difficulty is that we have no way to verify the original meaning. We cannot ask a Viking what they meant. We cannot observe how the language was actually used in context. We have only the texts, and the texts are incomplete, ambiguous, and filtered through centuries of transmission. Translation, then, becomes an act of interpretation. Every choice a translator makes, every word selected, every sentence structure imposed, reflects assumptions about what the original meant. Consider the phrase blowdorn, blood eagle. Blod clearly means blood. Orn clearly means eagle. But what does the compound mean? Is it a ritual called the blood eagle? Is it a poetic description, the eagle of blood, meaning something that resembles an eagle and involves blood? Is it a kenning for something else entirely? In English, we tend to read it as a name, the blood eagle, a specific thing with a specific meaning. But Old Norse compounds do not always work that way. They can be fluid, contextual, open to multiple interpretations. And here is another complication. The Ost manuscripts we have are not originals. They are copies of copies, made by scribes who may or may not have understood what they were copying. Medieval scribes made mistakes. They misread words. They corrected passages that seemed wrong to them. They sometimes added explanatory notes that later copyists incorporated into the main text. We know this happened because we can compare different manuscript versions of the same saga and see where they diverge. Sometimes the differences are minor, a word spelled differently, a sentence rearranged. Sometimes they are significant, entire passages present in one version and absent in another. The tale of Ragnar's sons exists in multiple versions. The description of Ella's death is not identical in all of them. Some versions are more detailed, some are more vague. Which version is closest to the original? We do not know. The original does not survive. So, when we read a modern English translation of the Blood Eagle passage, we are reading a scholar's best guess about what a 13th century Icelandic writer meant when he copied a story that had been passed down orally for centuries, possibly based on a poem that used metaphorical language that may or may not have been understood correctly even by the saga writer himself. This is not a solid foundation for certainty, and yet the image persists. The blood eagle has entered popular consciousness as a real thing, a historical fact, a Viking ritual that definitely happened. Why? Partly because the language sounds concrete. Ribs separated from the spine. Lungs pulled out. These are specific details. They create a vivid mental image, and vivid images are memorable. Partly because we want the Vikings to be fierce. We want them to be different from us, more primal, more willing to embrace extremes. The blood eagle fits that narrative. And partly because once an idea enters the historical imagination, it is difficult to dislodge. It gets repeated in books, documentaries, and television shows. Each repetition makes it seem more established, more certain, more real. But the language itself, the actual Old Norse words in the actual medieval manuscripts, does not support that certainty. What it supports is ambiguity, possibility. The recognition that we are looking at something through a glass darkly, and the glass is cracked, and the light is dim, and we may be seeing shapes that are not really there. This does not mean the blood eagle did not happen. It means we cannot know from the language alone whether it happened or not. And so we must turn to other forms of evidence. We must ask, if the blood eagle was a real practice, would it have left traces? Would archaeology reveal it? Would other sources mention it? The answer to those questions will shape how we understand the sagas themselves. The ground keeps secrets. For more than 1,000 years, archaeologists have excavated Viking Age sites across Scandinavia, Britain, Ireland, and beyond. They have found ships and swords, jewelry and coins, settlements and graves. The material remains of a culture that left its mark across half of Europe. But they have never found evidence of the blood eagle. This absence is significant, not conclusive, but significant. If the blood eagle was a practiced ritual, something done with any regularity to high-status enemies, we might expect to find traces. Human remains that show the specific pattern of injury described in the sagas. Skeletal evidence of ribs separated from the spine in a deliberate, systematic way. We have found no such evidence. This does not mean it never happened. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, as the saying goes. But it does mean we must think carefully about what archaeology can and cannot tell us. The Viking Age has left behind thousands of burials. Some are simple graves with few or no goods. Others are elaborate ship burials with weapons, tools, animals, and sometimes human sacrifices. Archaeologists have studied these remains extensively, documenting burial practices, social hierarchies, and patterns of violence. Viking skeletons show many types of injury. Battle wounds are common: cuts to the skull, severed limbs, penetrating injuries from arrows and spears. Some show signs of execution: clean cuts to the neck, blows to the back of the head. Some show evidence of torture or mutilation before death. But none show the specific pattern that would indicate a blood eagle execution. The ribs are delicate bones. If they were systematically cut away from the spine, the marks would be visible on the vertebrae. If the lungs were removed, there would be damage to the surrounding bone structure. If this was done while the victim was alive, there would be signs of healing or infection in cases where death was not immediate. Forensic archaeologists are skilled at reading these signs. They can distinguish between injuries inflicted before death and damage that occurred after. They can identify tool marks, determine the angle of cuts, and reconstruct the sequence of violence. If the blood eagle had been performed even once, and if that individual had been buried in a way that preserved their skeleton, we would expect to see it. We have not. This raises several possibilities. First, the blood eagle may never have happened. It may be entirely literary invention, a dramatic detail added by saga writers to emphasize the severity of revenge. Second, it may have happened so rarely, perhaps only the 2 times mentioned in the sagas, that the statistical chance of finding the remains is vanishingly small. Thousands of Viking Age burials have been excavated, but that is still a tiny fraction of the total population. Most people who died during that period left no archaeological trace. Third, victims of the blood eagle may not have been buried in ways that preserved their remains. They may have been thrown into the sea, burned, or left exposed. Ritual executions in other cultures sometimes involved disposal methods that prevented normal burial. Fourth, the injuries described in the sagas may not leave the skeletal evidence we would expect. If the ritual was more symbolic than the literal descriptions suggest, if it involved surface cuts rather than deep bone work, the marks might not survive on the skeleton. Each of these possibilities is plausible. None can be ruled out based on current evidence. But the absence still matters. Archaeology has confirmed many aspects of Viking culture that we know from the sagas. We have found the kinds of weapons described in the texts. We have found evidence of the trade routes, the settlements, the social structures. When the sagas describe a ship burial, we can point to actual ship burials that match the description. The sagas are not pure fiction. They contain genuine historical memory, even if that memory is filtered and shaped by later concerns. So, when the sagas describe a ritual execution, and archaeology finds no trace of it, we must take that seriously. It does not prove the ritual never happened, but it shifts the burden of proof. It means we cannot simply accept the saga accounts at face value. We must ask harder questions about their reliability. There is another form of archaeological evidence worth considering: comparative evidence from other cultures. Ritual execution is not unique to the Vikings. Many societies have practiced formalized methods of killing that served social, political, or religious purposes. Some of these methods were designed to be spectacular, to create fear, to demonstrate power. The Romans crucified rebels and slaves. Medieval Europeans drew and quartered traitors. The Aztecs performed heart sacrifice. The Chinese practiced ling qi, death by 1,000 cuts. In each case, we have both textual descriptions and, in some instances, physical evidence. We have skeletal remains that show the injuries. We have artistic depictions. We have multiple independent sources that corroborate the practice. For the blood eagle, we have none of this. We have 2 saga passages written centuries after the fact, with no corroborating evidence from archaeology, art, or independent textual sources. This does not fit the pattern of well-documented ritual executions. It fits better the pattern of literary motifs, dramatic elements that appear in stories because they serve narrative purposes, not because they reflect common practice. But there is a counter-argument. Some scholars point out that the absence of physical evidence may reflect the nature of the ritual itself. If the blood eagle was performed on living victims, death would have been rapid. The trauma to the chest cavity, the blood loss, the shock, these would have killed quickly. A quick death means less time for the body to respond to injury, less inflammation, less healing, less of the biological markers that archaeologists look for. Moreover, if the ritual was reserved for enemies of particular significance, the bodies may have been treated differently after death. They may not have received normal burial. They may have been desecrated further, dismembered, scattered. In Norse culture, denying someone a proper burial was a way of denying them honor in death. If the blood eagle was the ultimate expression of revenge, it might have been followed by the ultimate denial of rest. This is speculative, but it is not impossible. What we can say with confidence is this. Archaeology has not confirmed the blood eagle, but neither has it definitively disproven it. The ground is silent on this question, and silence in archaeology is always ambiguous. It can mean something never happened, or it can mean we have not yet found the evidence, or it can mean the evidence existed but did not survive. Viking Age sites are still being excavated. New techniques, isotope analysis, DNA testing, advanced imaging, are revealing information that earlier archaeologists could not access. It is possible that future discoveries will shed light on this question. But for now, we are left with absence, with the gap between what the sagas describe and what the earth reveals. This gap is important because it reminds us that the past is not fully recoverable. We have fragments, hints, pieces of a puzzle that will never be complete. The Vikings lived in a world of wood and cloth and flesh, materials that decay, that return to the soil, that leave little behind. What survives is mostly stone and metal and bone, the hard things, the durable things. But culture is not made only of hard things. It is made of words and gestures and beliefs. It is made of rituals that leave no trace except in memory. And memory, as we have seen, is unreliable. So we turn to another question. Who remembered the blood eagle? Who wrote it down? And what were their reasons for preserving this particular story? The answer takes us to medieval Iceland, to Christian scribes looking back at their pagan past, and to the complex politics of memory and identity. Iceland in the 13th century was a Christian society looking back at its pagan past. The conversion had happened more than 200 years earlier. In the year 1000 CE, at the Althing, Iceland's General Assembly, the decision was made to adopt Christianity as the official religion. It was a political choice as much as a spiritual one. Iceland was a small, isolated community that depended on the trade with Christian Europe. Remaining pagan meant remaining outside the networks of power and commerce that shaped the medieval world. So Iceland converted. But it did not forget. The people who wrote the sagas in the 13th century were the descendants of Vikings. Their great-great-grandfathers had worshipped Odin and Thor. Their family histories were intertwined with the pagan past, and they were proud of that past, even as they lived as Christians. This created a tension. How do you honor ancestors whose beliefs you have rejected? How do you preserve their stories without endorsing their values? The saga writers navigated this tension carefully. They wrote about pagan heroes with respect, even admiration. They preserved the old poems and genealogies. They treated the Viking Age as a time of greatness, when Icelanders were bold and independent. But they also wrote from a Christian perspective. They included moral commentary. They showed the limitations of pagan wisdom. They sometimes portrayed pre-Christian practices as dark or misguided. This matters when we consider the blood eagle. If the ritual was real, the saga writers had to decide how to present it. Do you describe it in detail, risking the appearance of glorifying violence? Do you minimize it, risking the loss of an important historical memory? Do you frame it as evidence of pagan barbarism, or as a legitimate expression of justice in a different moral framework? Different writers made different choices. The Orkneyinga saga is brief and matter-of-fact. It states that Einar had an eagle cut on Halfdan's back. No moral judgment, no elaboration, just the fact, presented as part of the narrative. This restraint is typical of the saga style. Saga writers generally avoided overt commentary. They presented events and let readers draw their own conclusions. But the brevity also raises questions. If the blood eagle was a spectacular ritual, why not describe it more fully? Why not explain what it meant, how it was performed, what it signified? The silence could mean the writer assumed his audience already knew. The ritual was familiar enough that it needed no explanation. Or it could mean the writer was uncomfortable with the subject. He included it because the tradition demanded it, but he did not want to dwell on it. Or it could mean the writer himself did not know the details. He had heard that Einar killed Halfdan in some distinctive way involving an eagle, but the specifics had been lost. We cannot know which interpretation is correct. The tale of Ragnar's sons is more elaborate, but it also presents problems. The tale is not a saga in the strict sense. It is a thatr, a short story or episode. It was likely composed for entertainment, drawing on legendary material about Ragnar Lothbrok, a figure who may or may not have been historical. Ragnar appears in multiple sagas and poems, but the accounts contradict each other. In some, he is a great king. In others, he is a legendary hero whose exploits are clearly exaggerated. The story of his death in a snake pit is dramatic and memorable, but it has the quality of folklore rather than history. If Ragnar himself is semi-legendary, what does that mean for the story of his son's revenge? It means we must be cautious. The tale may preserve genuine traditions about Viking raids on England in the 9th century. But it may also include invented details designed to make the story more compelling. The blood eagle, in this context, serves a narrative purpose. It demonstrates the completeness of the son's revenge. It shows that they did not simply kill Ella, they killed him in a way that matched the horror of their father's death. Snake pit for snake pit. Spectacular death for spectacular death. This is good storytelling. But good storytelling is not the same as accurate history. And here is where the Christian context becomes crucial. The saga writers were not neutral observers. They were Christians writing about pagans. They were Icelanders writing about Norwegians and Danes and Swedes. They were 13th century people writing about the 9th century. Each of these distances created opportunities for misunderstanding, reinterpretation, and bias. Christian writers in the Middle Ages often portrayed pagans as violent and barbaric. This was not unique to Iceland. Across Europe, Christian chroniclers described pre-Christian peoples as savage, cruel, and given to terrible practices. Some of these descriptions were accurate. Some were exaggerated. Some were invented to justify conquest or conversion. The Vikings, in particular, were portrayed by their Christian enemies as uniquely violent. English and Frankish chronicles describe Viking raids in lurid detail, emphasizing atrocities and destruction. These accounts served a purpose. They explained why God had allowed such suffering, and they justified resistance and eventual Christian victory. Icelandic saga writers were more sympathetic to the Vikings. These were their ancestors, after all. But they were still influenced by Christian literary conventions. They knew how pagans were supposed to be portrayed. They knew what kinds of stories Christian audiences expected. Could the blood eagle be a detail that fit those expectations? A way of showing that, yes, the pagan Vikings were fierce and formidable, capable of acts that would shock Christian sensibilities? It is possible. But there is a counter-argument. If the saga writers wanted to invent atrocities to make the Vikings seem more barbaric, why stop at 2 examples? Why not include the blood eagle in more sagas, applied to more victims? The fact that it appears so rarely suggests it was not a standard literary motif. It was something specific, tied to specific stories, preserved because those stories were well known. This brings us to the question of sources. The saga writers did not invent their material from nothing. They drew on earlier poems, oral traditions, and possibly written notes. Some of these sources were quite old, dating back to the Viking Age itself. Skaldic poems, in particular, were composed by court poets who witnessed the events they described. These poems were memorized and passed down with remarkable accuracy. We know this because some skaldic verses are quoted in multiple sagas, and the wording is nearly identical across different manuscripts. If the blood eagle appeared in an early skaldic poem, the saga writers would have felt obligated to include it, even if they did not fully understand it or approve of it. This is where the language question returns. If the original poem used metaphorical language, an eagle was cut on his back, and later generations took it literally, the saga writers would have recorded the literal interpretation because that was the tradition they inherited. They were not trying to deceive. They were trying to preserve. But preservation across centuries is never perfect. There is also the question of audience. Who were the sagas written for? They were written for Icelanders, primarily. People who knew the old stories, who had heard them recited at feasts and gatherings, who had opinions about which versions were correct. If a saga writer invented a major detail, like a ritual execution that never happened, his audience would have noticed. They would have objected. The saga would have lost credibility. This suggests that the blood eagle, in some form, was part of the tradition the saga writers inherited. They did not make it up, but they may have misunderstood it, or they may have recorded a version that had already been distorted by earlier misunderstanding. The Christian context also affects how we read the moral framework of the sagas. In Christian thought, revenge is problematic. "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord." Humans are not supposed to take justice into their own hands. especially not in ways that involve cruelty or excess. But in the pagan Viking worldview, revenge was not only acceptable, it was necessary. To fail to avenge a wrong was to accept dishonor. It was to invite further attacks. It was to betray your family and your reputation. The saga writers understood both frameworks. They lived in the Christian one, but they wrote about people who lived in the pagan one. When they described the blood eagle, they were describing an act that made sense within the pagan honor culture, even if it seemed excessive by Christian standards. This does not tell us whether the act actually happened, but it tells us that the saga writers believed it was the kind of thing that could have happened. It fit their understanding of how Vikings thought about revenge and honor and the proper response to grave offenses. And that understanding was not entirely invented. The saga writers had access to traditions, poems, and cultural memory that we do not. They were closer to the Viking Age than we are. They spoke a language that was a direct descendant of Old Norse. They lived in a society that still remembered, however imperfectly, what the pagan world had been like. So when they wrote about the blood eagle, they were not writing in a vacuum. They were working with inherited material, shaped by their own Christian perspective, but rooted in something older. What that something was, historical fact, poetic metaphor, or legendary elaboration, remains unclear. But the fact that Christian writers preserved. Chapter 5. Medieval Christian writers and Bias Iceland in the 13th century was a Christian society looking back at its pagan past. The conversion had happened more than 200 years earlier. In the year 999 or 1000 CE, the Icelandic assembly, the Althing, made a collective decision to adopt Christianity. It was a political choice as much as a religious one. Iceland was a small, isolated community that depended on the trade with Christian Europe. Remaining pagan meant remaining outside the networks of power and commerce that shaped the medieval world. So Iceland converted, but it did not forget. The people who wrote the sagas in the 13th century were the descendants of Vikings. Their great-great-grandparents had worshipped Odin and Thor. Their family histories were intertwined with the pagan past, and they were proud of that heritage, even as they practiced a different faith. This created a tension. How do you honor ancestors whose beliefs you have rejected? How do you preserve their stories without endorsing their values? The saga writers navigated this tension carefully. They wrote about pagan heroes with respect, even admiration. They preserved the old poems and genealogies. They treated the pre-Christian past as a source of identity and pride. But they also wrote from a Christian perspective. They could not help it. Their worldview was shaped by Christian ideas about sin, redemption, and divine justice. Their literary models were Christian texts, saints' lives, biblical narratives, European romances. When they described pagan rituals, they did so with a certain distance. They reported what their ancestors had done, but they did not always explain why. They preserved the surface of the past without fully inhabiting its interior logic. This matters when we consider the blood eagle. If the saga writers encountered a story about a brutal execution, whether real or legendary, how would they have handled it? They might have preserved it faithfully, as a historical fact worth recording. They might have embellished it, to make the story more dramatic. Or they might have invented it entirely, to emphasize the difference between pagan violence and Christian mercy. We cannot know which of these happened, but we can examine the context in which the sagas were written and ask what purposes the blood eagle story might have served. One possibility is that it functioned as a marker of difference. Look how fierce our ancestors were. Look how far we have come. This is what people did before Christ brought civilization and law. Medieval Christian writers often portrayed pagans, whether Vikings, Saxons, or others, as violent and barbaric. This was not always inaccurate, but it was selective. Christian societies were also violent. Medieval Europe was full of wars, executions, and brutal punishments. But when Christians killed, it was framed as justice or necessity. When pagans killed, it was framed as savagery. The blood eagle could fit this pattern. A ritual execution so extreme that it demonstrated the moral superiority of the Christian present over the pagan past. But there is a problem with this interpretation. The sagas do not condemn the blood eagle. They do not present it as evidence of pagan depravity. They present it as revenge. Terrible, yes, but also justified within the logic of the story. Halfdan was a tyrant. Ella killed Ragnar in a dishonorable way. The blood eagle, in both cases, is portrayed as a fitting response. Extreme, but proportional to the offense. This does not sound like Christian propaganda. It sounds like the preservation of a pagan value system, one in which revenge was not only acceptable but necessary. So perhaps the saga writers were not trying to condemn their ancestors. Perhaps they were trying to understand them, to preserve their stories even when those stories made them uncomfortable. This brings us to another question. Who were these writers? We do not know the names of most saga authors. The texts were copied and recopied, often anonymously. But we know they were educated men, likely trained in monasteries or by the church. They knew Latin. They had read European literature. They understood the conventions of medieval storytelling. They were also Icelanders, deeply invested in their own history and identity. Iceland had no king, no central authority. What held the society together was law, kinship, and shared memory. The sagas were part of that memory. They told Icelanders who they were and where they came from. In this context, the blood eagle serves a different purpose. It is not propaganda, it is identity. It says, our ancestors were formidable. They did not forgive easily. They remembered wrongs and repaid them in full. This was important in a society where honor still mattered, even under Christianity, where feuds still erupted, where reputation could mean the difference between prosperity and ruin. The sagas taught lessons. Not always moral lessons in the Christian sense, but practical lessons about how to navigate a world where violence was always a possibility. But there is yet another layer to consider. The saga writers were not just preserving Icelandic stories. They were also drawing on broader European traditions. Medieval literature is full of spectacular executions. Saints' lives describe martyrdoms in graphic detail. Bodies torn apart, burned, boiled. Romances describe villains punished in elaborate ways. Chronicles describe traitors executed with maximum cruelty. This was a literary convention. Extreme violence served narrative purposes. It demonstrated the stakes. It satisfied the audience's desire for justice. It made stories memorable. The blood eagle could be part of this convention. A literary flourish borrowed from the broader medieval imagination and grafted onto Viking history. We know that saga writers borrowed from other sources. They incorporated elements from Irish tales, French romances, and classical literature. They were not writing in isolation. They were part of a medieval literary culture that spanned Europe. Could the blood eagle be one of those borrowed elements? A detail imported from elsewhere and attributed to the Vikings because it fit the image of fierce pagan warriors? It is possible. but it is also speculative. We have no direct evidence of borrowing in this case. What we do have is a pattern. The blood eagle appears in two sagas, both written in the same century, both in Iceland, both by Christian authors looking back at the pagan past. It does not appear in earlier sources. It does not appear in contemporary accounts from outside Scandinavia. It does not appear in the skaldic poems that supposedly inspired the saga passages. Or, if it does, the language is so ambiguous that scholars cannot agree on what it means. This pattern suggests that the blood eagle, as we understand it, may be a 13th century creation. Not necessarily invented from whole cloth, but shaped, elaborated, and given its current form by the saga writers themselves. They may have taken a kernel of truth, a poetic phrase about an eagle and a back, and expanded it into a detailed description. They may have combined different stories or different traditions. They may have filled in gaps with their own imagination. This is what storytellers do. They take fragments and make them whole. They take ambiguity and make it concrete. They take the past and make it comprehensible to the present. But in doing so, they also transform it. The past they preserve is not the past as it was. It is the past as they understood it, filtered through their own concerns and shaped by their own literary conventions. This does not make the sagas worthless, but it does make them complicated. When we read about the blood eagle, we are not reading a straightforward historical account. We are reading a text produced by Christian writers in medieval Iceland, drawing on oral traditions of uncertain reliability, shaped by literary conventions we do not fully understand and serving purposes we can only guess at. And yet the story has power. It has survived for 800 years. It has captured imaginations across cultures and centuries. It has become, in some sense, more real than the historical events it may or may not describe. This is the paradox of historical memory. The stories we tell about the past shape how we understand it. And once a story takes hold, it becomes difficult to separate from the reality it claims to represent. The blood eagle is now part of Viking history, whether it happened or not. It is part of how we imagine the Vikings, and that imagination, in turn, shapes how we interpret the evidence. This brings us to the present, to the scholars who have studied this question, to the debates that continue, and to the recognition that certainty, in this case, may be impossible. The debate began in earnest in the 20th century. Before that, the blood eagle was largely accepted as historical fact. Scholars read the sagas, noted the descriptions, and assumed they reflected real Viking practices. There was little reason to question it. The Vikings were known to be violent. The sagas described violence. The two seemed to fit together naturally. But as the study of Old Norse literature became more sophisticated, questions emerged. In 1984, Roberta Frank published an article that changed the conversation. Frank was a professor of medieval studies, an expert in Old Norse poetry and saga literature. Her article, titled Viking Atrocity and Skaldic Verse, The Right of the Blood Eagle, argued that the blood eagle was likely a misunderstanding. Frank examined the skaldic poems that the sagas referenced or quoted. She looked at the language carefully, paying attention to poetic conventions and metaphorical structures, and she concluded that the phrase about cutting an eagle on someone's back was probably a kenning, a poetic metaphor, not a literal description. In skaldic poetry, she argued, an eagle on the back could mean that the victim died in battle with their back exposed to weapons. Or it could mean that carrion birds, eagles, and ravens fed on the corpse. Both were common images in Norse poetry. Both fit the context better than a ritual execution. The more elaborate description in the tale of Ragnar's sons, the ribs separated, the lungs pulled out, Frank attributed to later misunderstanding. A saga writer encountered the poetic phrase, did not recognize it as metaphor, and expanded it into a literal description based on his own imagination. Frank's argument was careful and well-researched. It drew on deep knowledge of Old Norse poetic conventions, and it was persuasive to many scholars, but not to all. Other historians pointed out the problems with Frank's interpretation. If the blood eagle was purely metaphorical, why did it appear in prose sagas rather than just in poetry? Sagas generally avoided the kind of elaborate metaphors that characterized skaldic verse. They told stories in relatively straightforward language. Moreover, the sagas describe other ritual practices that we know were real. They describe human sacrifice. They describe elaborate funeral rites. They describe specific execution methods. Why would the blood eagle be the only invented ritual? And if it was a misunderstanding, why does it appear in two separate sagas describing two separate events with similar language? Misunderstandings usually produce variation, not consistency. These objections did not disprove Frank's argument, but they suggested that the question was more complicated than it first appeared. In the years since Frank's article, the scholarly consensus has remained divided. Some historians accept her interpretation. They argue that the blood eagle is a literary creation, born from misread poetry and elaborated by saga writers who wanted to make their stories more dramatic. Others remain open to the possibility that it was real. They point out that Viking culture did include ritual violence, that revenge killings were sometimes elaborate and symbolic, that the absence of archaeological evidence is not conclusive. Still, others occupy a middle ground. They suggest that something happened, perhaps a particularly brutal execution, perhaps a symbolic act that was less extreme than the sagas describe, and that this event was then transformed through oral tradition and literary elaboration into the blood eagle as we know it. This middle position is worth considering carefully. Oral traditions are not static. They change over time. Details are added, removed, or altered. Events are combined or separated. Motivations are reinterpreted. But oral traditions also preserve core elements with remarkable accuracy. The names of important people, the basic sequence of events, the emotional truth of a story, even if the factual details shift. It is possible that the blood eagle began as a real event, an execution that was unusual enough to be remembered, and that over generations of retelling, it became more elaborate, more symbolic, more extreme. By the time the saga writers encountered the story, it may have already been transformed. They recorded what they heard, believing it to be accurate, not realizing that the tradition had evolved far from its original form. This would explain both the consistency and the ambiguity. The core story, an enemy executed in a distinctive way involving an eagle, remained stable. But the details varied because different storytellers filled in the gaps differently. It would also explain why the sagas present the blood eagle without much elaboration. The writers assumed their audience knew the story. They did not need to explain it because it was already part of the cultural memory. But this is speculation. We have no way to trace the evolution of the story with certainty. We have only the end result, the saga texts as they exist, and we must work backward from there. Modern scholars have also considered the blood eagle in comparative context. Other cultures have practiced ritual executions that were designed to be spectacular and memorable. The Romans crucified enemies of the state. Medieval Europeans drew and quartered traitors. The Aztecs performed heart sacrifice on temple pyramids. In each case, the execution served multiple purposes. It punished the victim. It demonstrated the power of the executioner. It reinforced social boundaries. And it created a story that would be told and retold, serving as a warning to others. The blood eagle, if it was real, would fit this pattern. It would have been a way of saying, "This is what happens to those who wrong us. This is the price of betrayal or tyranny." Remember this. But there is a difference between the blood eagle and these other examples. For crucifixion, drawing and quartering, and heart sacrifice, we have extensive evidence. Multiple sources, archaeological remains, artistic depictions, legal documents. For the blood eagle, we have 2 saga passages and nothing else. This asymmetry is striking. If the blood eagle was a practiced ritual, even a rare one, we would expect more evidence. More mentions in different sources. More traces in the material record. The fact that we do not have this evidence suggests that the blood eagle was either extremely rare or not real at all. Some scholars have proposed a third possibility, that the blood eagle was real but was not a Viking practice. This argument suggests that the execution method described in the sagas may have been borrowed from another culture or another time period. Medieval writers sometimes attributed practices to the wrong people or the wrong era. They combined different traditions or misremembered details. Could the blood eagle be a garbled memory of an execution method used by someone else? Romans, Celts, Anglo-Saxons, that was later attributed to the Vikings. It is possible, but there is no evidence for this either. No other culture has a documented practice that matches the blood eagle description. So we are left with uncertainty. The scholarly debate continues, but it has not produced consensus. Different experts, looking at the same evidence, reach different conclusions. This is not unusual in historical studies. Many questions about the past cannot be answered definitively. We work with incomplete information, ambiguous sources, and the recognition that certainty is often impossible. What we can say is this: the blood eagle, as described in the sagas, is not well supported by evidence. It appears in only 2 sources, both written centuries after the alleged events. The language is ambiguous, the archaeology is silent, and the broader context suggests that if it happened at all, it was extraordinarily rare. But we cannot rule it out entirely. The Vikings did practice ritual violence. They did value symbolic acts. They did believe that how someone died mattered as much as the fact of their death. It is possible that the blood eagle happened once or twice, in specific circumstances, as an extreme expression of revenge. It is possible that the memory of these events was preserved in oral tradition and eventually written down in the sagas. It is also possible that it never happened, that it was a poetic metaphor taken literally, that it was a literary invention designed to make a story more memorable. Both possibilities remain open, and perhaps that is the most honest conclusion we can reach. Not certainty, but acknowledgement of the limits of our knowledge. The past is not fully recoverable. We have fragments, hints, shadows. We do our best to interpret them, but interpretation is not the same as knowledge. The blood eagle exists in that uncertain space. It is part history, part legend, part literary creation. It is real in the sense that people have believed in it for centuries. But whether it was real in the sense of actually happening, that remains unknown. And in some ways, the uncertainty is more interesting than any definitive answer could be. Because the blood eagle, real or not, tells us something important about how we remember violence, how we create legends, how we use the past to understand ourselves. It tells us that stories have power, that they shape our imagination, that they become, in a sense, more real than the events they describe. And it reminds us that history is not just about what happened. It is about what we believe happened, about the stories we tell, about the questions we cannot answer. The blood eagle has endured not because we know it was real, but because we cannot know for certain that it was not. And that uncertainty, that gap between evidence and imagination, is where legends live. The Vikings are everywhere now. They appear in television shows and films, in video games and novels, in comic books and heavy metal album covers. The modern imagination has embraced them as symbols of strength, freedom, and primal authenticity. And wherever the Vikings appear in popular culture, the blood eagle is often not far behind. It has become one of the most recognizable elements of Viking lore. More famous in some ways than actual historical practices that we know occurred. More memorable than the thing system, the Althing, or the intricate legal codes that governed Viking society. Why? The answer tells us as much about ourselves as it does about the Vikings. We are drawn to extremes, to the edges of human experience, to stories that push boundaries and challenge our comfort. The Blood Eagle offers all of this. It is dark, mysterious, and just plausible enough to seem real. It also fits a narrative we want to believe about the past. That people were harder then, more willing to embrace violence, less constrained by the moral frameworks that govern modern life. This narrative is not entirely wrong. Medieval societies were more violent than most modern ones. Life was shorter, more precarious, more shaped by physical force. The Vikings, in particular, lived in a world where violence was a constant possibility. But the narrative is also incomplete. It reduces complex cultures to simple stereotypes. It ignores the laws, the poetry, the trade networks, the domestic life. It focuses on the spectacular and ignores the ordinary. The Blood Eagle is spectacular, and so it dominates our imagination. The modern fascination began in many ways with the History Channel series Vikings, which premiered in 2013. The show depicted the Blood Eagle in graphic detail in its second season. The scene was shocking, visceral, designed to leave an impression. And it did. The episode sparked widespread discussion. Articles were written. Historians were interviewed. The Blood Eagle became a topic of conversation far beyond academic circles. Other shows followed. The Last Kingdom referenced it. Norsemen, a Norwegian comedy series, parodied it. Video games like Assassin's Creed Valhalla included it as an execution option. Each appearance reinforced the idea that the Blood Eagle was a real Viking practice. Each repetition made it seem more established, more certain, more historical. But popular culture is not history. It is entertainment, and entertainment has different goals than scholarship. A television show wants to create memorable moments. It wants to shock and engage its audience. It wants to build a world that feels authentic, even if that authenticity is more about atmosphere than accuracy. The Blood Eagle serves these purposes perfectly. It is visually striking. It is emotionally powerful. It creates a sense of danger and otherness. It tells the audience, this is a different world with different rules, where people were capable of things we cannot imagine. This is effective storytelling, but it is not necessarily accurate history. The problem is that most people encounter the Vikings through popular culture, not through academic texts. They watch Vikings or play Assassin's Creed and assume that what they are seeing is based on solid historical evidence. And in many cases, it is. The shows and games often consult historians. They draw on archaeological findings. They try to get the details right: the clothing, the weapons, the ships. But they also take liberties. They compress timelines. They invent characters. They dramatize events. And they include elements like the blood eagle because they make for good television, regardless of whether the historical evidence supports them. This creates a feedback loop. Popular culture presents the blood eagle as real. Audiences accept it as real. And then the idea becomes so widespread that it is difficult to challenge. Historians who point out the ambiguity of the evidence are often dismissed. The response is, "But I saw it on television. But it was in the game. But everyone knows the Vikings did this." This is how myths are made in the modern age. Not through oral tradition passed down over generations, but through mass media consumed by millions simultaneously. The blood eagle has become a modern myth. It exists in the space between history and imagination, sustained by our desire for the past to be more dramatic than it probably was. But there is another dimension to consider. The blood eagle also appeals to something darker in human nature: a fascination with cruelty, a curiosity about the limits of what people can do to each other. This is not new. Medieval audiences were drawn to stories of martyrdom and torture. Renaissance audiences flocked to public executions. Victorian audiences read penny dreadfuls filled with lurid violence. Every age has its own way of engaging with darkness. Ours includes historical dramas that depict extreme violence in high definition. There is nothing inherently wrong with this. Fiction has always explored the darker aspects of human experience. It allows us to confront difficult subjects in a safe context. It helps us process our own capacity for violence and our fear of being its victim. But there is a responsibility that comes with depicting historical violence. A responsibility to distinguish between what we know happened and what we imagine happened. A responsibility to avoid glorifying cruelty or presenting it as more common than it was. The blood eagle, in popular culture, often lacks this context. It is presented as a Viking practice, full stop. Not as a disputed historical claim. Not as something that appears in only 2 medieval sources with ambiguous language. Not as something that scholars debate. Just, this is what the Vikings did, and that simplification does a disservice both to history and to the audience. It makes the Vikings seem more uniformly violent than they were. It obscures the complexity of their culture. It reduces them to caricatures, fierce warriors who delighted in cruelty. The real Vikings were more interesting than that. They were farmers and traders. They were poets and lawmakers. They were explorers who reached North America centuries before Columbus. They were craftspeople who created intricate jewelry and sophisticated ships. Yes, they were also warriors. Yes, they raided and conquered. Yes, they were capable of violence, but they were not defined solely by violence. And the practices that defined them, the thing assemblies, the gift economies, the complex kinship networks, are less dramatic than the blood eagle but more important for understanding who they actually were. Popular culture, by focusing on the spectacular, distorts this picture. It gives us Vikings who are all edge and no center, all violence and no context. This matters because how we imagine the past shapes how we understand the present. If we believe that people in the past were fundamentally different from us, more violent, more cruel, less constrained by morality, then we misunderstand human nature. The truth is that people in the past were not so different. They loved and feared and hoped much as we do. They built communities. They created art. They tried to make sense of a world that was often harsh and unpredictable. The violence they committed was not because they were inherently more brutal. It was because they lived in circumstances that made violence more necessary, more common, more integrated into daily life. Understanding this does not excuse the violence, but it does humanize it. It reminds us that the capacity for cruelty is not unique to any particular time or culture. It is part of the human condition. The blood eagle, whether real or imagined, is a reminder of that capacity. But it should not be the only thing we remember about the Vikings. There is a broader lesson here about historical memory and popular culture. The stories we tell about the past are never neutral. They always serve purposes in the present. The blood eagle serves a purpose. It makes the Vikings seem more exotic, more dangerous, more worthy of our fascination. It creates a sense of distance between their world and ours. But that distance is partly illusory. The Vikings were people. They lived in communities. They had laws and customs. They were not chaos incarnate. And the more we focus on the extreme and the spectacular, the more we lose sight of the ordinary and the human. This is not an argument against depicting violence in historical fiction. Violence was real. It shaped lives and societies. It deserves to be represented. But it should be represented with care, with context, with acknowledgement of what we know and what we do not know. The blood eagle has become shorthand for Viking brutality, but it is shorthand based on uncertain evidence, amplified by modern media, and sustained by our own fascination with darkness. It is a story we tell ourselves about the past, and like all stories, it reveals as much about the storyteller as about the subject. We want the Vikings to be fierce. We want them to be different. We want them to have practiced rituals that shock and awe us. And so we accept the blood eagle as real, even when the evidence is thin, even when scholars express doubt, even when the sources are ambiguous, because the story is too good to let go, too memorable, too perfectly suited to our image of what the Vikings should have been. And, in the end, that is what the blood eagle has become. Not a historical fact, but a cultural artifact. A story that tells us more about our own time than about the Viking Age. It endures not because it is true, but because it is useful. Because it serves our need for the past to be dramatic and extreme. Because it gives us a way to think about violence and revenge and the limits of human behavior. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the blood eagle does not need to be historically accurate to be culturally significant. But we should know the difference. We should understand that what we see on television is not the same as what happened in history. That the stories we tell are shaped by our own concerns, our own values, our own need for meaning. The blood eagle is a mirror. It reflects our fascination with the Vikings, our discomfort with violence, our desire to believe that the past was more extreme than the present. And when we look into that mirror, we should ask ourselves, what are we really seeing? The Vikings as they were, or the Vikings as we need them to be? The North Sea still remembers. It remembers the longships and the men who sailed them. It remembers the stories they told and the songs they sang, and it remembers the questions that have no answers. The blood eagle is one of those questions. We have walked through the evidence together. We have examined the sagas that mention it, brief, ambiguous, written centuries after the events they describe. We have considered the language, the poetry, the possibility of metaphor and misunderstanding. We have looked at what archaeology reveals and what it does not. We have thought about who wrote these stories and why. And at the end of this long exploration, we arrive not at certainty, but at something more valuable. We arrive at understanding. Understanding that the past is not a fixed thing we can know completely. It is a landscape glimpsed through fog, where some features are clear and others remain hidden, where absence of evidence creates space for imagination, where stories and facts intertwine until they cannot be separated. The blood eagle may have been real. It may have been performed once, twice, in moments of extreme revenge against enemies who had committed unforgivable acts. It may have been exactly as the sagas describe, a ritual execution designed to send a message that would echo through generations. Or it may have been metaphor, a poetic way of describing death in battle, a phrase that later generations took literally because they had lost the context, the cultural knowledge, the understanding of how their ancestors spoke. Or it may have been something in between, a kernel of truth, an unusual execution, a symbolic act that grew in the telling until it became the elaborate ritual we read about in medieval texts. We do not know, and we may never know, but the uncertainty itself is instructive. It reminds us that history is not a collection of facts waiting to be discovered. It is an ongoing conversation between the present and the past. A conversation shaped by the questions we ask, the evidence we find, and the stories we choose to tell. The Vikings left behind many things: ships that carried them across unknown seas, swords that defended their homes, laws that governed their communities, poems that preserved their values, settlements that became cities. But they also left behind silence, gaps in the record, questions without answers. The blood eagle lives in those gaps. It exists in the space between what we know and what we imagine, between history and legend, between the Vikings as they were and the Vikings as we need them to be. And perhaps that is where it belongs. Not as established fact, but as enduring mystery. Not as something we can prove or disprove, but as something that invites us to think more carefully about evidence, interpretation, and the nature of historical knowledge itself. There is a quiet power in unanswered questions. They keep us humble. They remind us that certainty is rare and often illusory. They teach us to sit with ambiguity, to accept that some things cannot be known, and to find value in the search itself rather than only in the finding. The Vikings understood this in their way. Their myths were full of unanswered questions. Ragnarok, the end of the world, was prophesied, but its details remained unclear. The gods themselves did not know everything. Odin sought wisdom constantly, sacrificing much to gain it, yet never achieving complete knowledge. This acceptance of uncertainty was woven into their worldview. The future was not fixed. Fate was real, but not absolute. Knowledge was valuable, but always incomplete. We could learn from this. In an age that demands certainty, that wants every question answered immediately, that treats ambiguity as failure, the blood eagle offers a different lesson. Some questions are more valuable unanswered. Some mysteries are worth preserving. Some stories matter not because they are true in a factual sense, but because they are true in a deeper way, because they capture something essential about human nature, about violence and revenge, about memory and meaning. The blood eagle, real or imagined, tells us that people have always grappled with the limits of justice. That revenge, however satisfying in theory, is complicated in practice. That the stories we tell about violence reveal our values, our fears, our understanding of what it means to be human. These truths persist regardless of whether the ritual actually happened. They are embedded in the story itself, in the fact that it was told and retold, written down and preserved, debated and discussed across centuries. And so the blood eagle endures, not as fact, but as legend, not as history, but as story, not as something we know, but as something we wonder about. And in the wondering, we learn. We learn about the Vikings, yes, but we also learn about ourselves, about what draws us to the past, about what we seek in stories of violence and revenge, about how we construct meaning from fragments and silence. The night is quiet now, the kind of quiet that invites reflection, the kind that makes space for thoughts to settle and questions to rest without needing immediate answers. If you have stayed with this exploration to the end, you understand that some journeys are not about reaching a destination. They are about the walking itself, about paying attention, about noticing what is there and what is not there, about learning to be comfortable with uncertainty. This is what Archive of Rest offers. Not quick answers or simple narratives, but slow, careful attention to the past. Stories told without haste. Questions examined without rushing to conclusions. History treated as something worthy of patience and respect. If this approach speaks to you, if you find value in the slow unfolding of complex questions, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this, more mysteries to explore, more quiet journeys through the darker corners of history. The Blood Eagle will continue to fascinate. It will appear in new shows, new games, new books. Each generation will encounter it and wonder, was this real? And the answer will remain the same. We do not know. We cannot know. And perhaps that is exactly as it should be. The past keeps its secrets. The sagas preserve their ambiguities. And we, in the present, are left to wonder and imagine and search for meaning in the spaces between certainty and doubt. This is enough. This is more than enough. The story is told. The question remains. And the North Sea, as always, remembers everything and reveals nothing. Rest well.